Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I also commend the Honourable Lady for the work that she has done. This was born out of personal sadness, but there are many families in the future who will benefit from the passion, commitment and determination that she has shown in championing this issue. She said sometimes she's been impatient. Sometimes you have to be impatient because it's that impatience that spurs others on. I'm pleased that we have been able to introduce this fund, and I would echo the Speaker's comments in commending the Honourable Lady for the way in which she has championed this cause. As I say, we share and are concerned about her own personal sadness that she went through, but she has taken that and put it to good benefit for families up and down the country. With permission, Mr. Speaker, I would like to make a statement on my final G20 and final European Council as Prime Minister. At this G20 Summit in Japan, we discussed some of the biggest global challenges facing our nations, including climate change, terrorist propaganda online, risks to the global economy and rising tensions in the Gulf. These discussions were at times difficult, but in the end productive. I profoundly believe that we're stronger when we work together. With threats to global stability and trade, that principle is now more important than ever. And throughout this summit, my message was on the overriding need for international cooperation and compromise. Alongside discussions with international partners on economic and security matters, I made clear Britain would always stand by the global rules as the best means of securing peace and prosperity for all of us. I will take the main issues in turn. Mr. Speaker, on no other issue is the need for international collaboration greater than in the threat to our countries and our people from climate change. As I arrived in Osaka last week, I was immensely proud that Britain had become the world's first major economy to commit in law to ending our contribution to global warming by 2050. I urged other G20 countries to follow Britain's lead and set similarly ambitious net zero targets for their own countries. Those gathered at this year's summit are the last generation of leaders with the power to limit global warming, and I believe we have a duty to heed the call from those asking us to act now for the sake of future generations. Taken together, G20 countries account for 80% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Discussions were not always easy, but 19 of the G20 members agreed to the irreversibility of the Paris Climate Change Agreement and the importance of implementing our commitments in full. It remains a disappointment that the United States continues to opt out on such a critical global issue. I outlined Britain's continued determination to lead the way on climate change through our bid to host, along with Italy, COP26 next year. And recognising that more needs to be done to support developing countries in managing the impacts of climate change, I announced the UK's aid budget will be aligned with our climate change goals and used to support the transition to lower greenhouse gas emissions. Mr. Speaker, both as Prime Minister and previously as Home Secretary, I've repeatedly called for greater action to protect people from online harms and remove terrorist propaganda from the internet. In 2017, the attacks in Manchester and London showed how technology could be exploited by terrorists. Following those events, the UK took the lead and put this issue squarely on the global agenda. Through our efforts, the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism was established, a body which has leveraged technology to automate the removal of propaganda online. But the horrendous attack in Christchurch reminded us that we must maintain momentum and ensure a better coordinated and swifter response to ensure terrorists are never able to broadcast their atrocities in real time. So I welcome the pledge by G20 leaders at this year's summit to do more to build on existing efforts and stop terrorists exploiting the internet. The UK will continue to lead the way in this, including through our support of the major technology companies in developing a new crisis response mechanism. Mr. Speaker, at this summit, discussions on the global economy were held against the backdrop of current trade tensions between the United States and China. In this context, I reaffirmed Britain's commitment to free and fair trade, open markets and the rules-based trading system as the best means to bolster prosperity and build economies that work for everyone. The UK has long argued that the rules governing global trade need urgent reform and updating to reflect the changing nature of that trade. We continue to press for action to build upon the agreement reached at last year's summit for WTO reform, and I believe the best way to resolve disputes is through a reformed and strengthened WTO rather than by increasing tariffs. This G20 was also an opportunity to discuss wider global issues with others, including Prime Minister Abe, President Erdogan, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and United Nations Secretary-General Guterres. In my conversation with Prime Minister Abe, I paid tribute to him for hosting this G20 and thanked him for his role in strengthening the relationship between the UK and Japan, a relationship I have every confidence will continue to grow over the coming years. In a number of my meetings, I discussed Iran and rising tensions in the Gulf. Escalation is in no one's interest, and engagement is needed on all sides to find a diplomatic solution to the current situation and to counter Iran's destabilising activity. At the same time, I was clear the UK will continue to work intensively with our JCPOA partners to keep the Iran nuclear deal in place. The breach of that deal by Iran is extremely concerning, and together with France, Germany and the other signatories of the deal, we are urging Iran not to take further steps away from the agreement and to return to compliance. The deal makes the world safer, and I want to see Iran uphold its obligations. Mr. Speaker, I believe wholeheartedly in never shying away from difficult conversations when it is right to hold them. In my meeting with President Putin, I told him there can be no normalisation of our bilateral relationship until Russia stops the irresponsible activity that threatens the UK and its allies. The use of a deadly nerve agent on the streets of our country was a despicable act which led to the death of Dawn Sturgis. I was clear the UK has irrefutable evidence that Russia was behind the attack and that we want to see the two individuals responsible brought to justice. While the UK remains open to a different relationship, for that to happen, the Russian government must choose a different path. Finally, in my discussion with UN Secretary-General Guterres, we spoke about the importance of the multilateral system and the UK's strong support for it. I also raised concerns about the Ebola outbreak in the Democratic Republic of Congo and the need to ensure a comprehensive response, as well as emphasising the critical nature of continued humanitarian assistance in Yemen. I'm proud that the UK continues to play its part in trying to provide relief in countries such as Yemen, and that we remain committed to spending 0.7% of our gross national income on development assistance. That commitment puts us at the forefront of addressing global challenges. So I'm pleased at this summit we announced our pledge of £1.4 billion for the Global Fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis and malaria and help save lives. Mr. Speaker, turning to the European Council, the focus of these discussions were on what are known as the EU's top jobs, the appointments at the head of the EU's institutions and the EU's High Representative. As I've said before, this is primarily a matter for the remaining 27 EU member states. But while we remain a member of the EU, I also said we would engage constructively, which we did throughout. After long and difficult discussions over the last few days, the Council voted for a package of candidates with an important balance of gender, reflecting the diversity of the European Union. The Council formally elected Belgian Prime Minister Charles Michel as President of the European Council. The Council also nominated German Defence Minister Ursula von der Leyen as candidate for President of the European Commission, Spanish Foreign Minister Josep Borrell Fontelles as candidate for High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, and the French Managing Director of the IMF, Christine Lagarde, as candidate for President of the European Central Bank. The Commission President will now be voted on by the European Parliament in the coming weeks. After being approved by the Commission President, the High Representative will then be voted on as part of the College of Commissioners by the European Parliament, before the College is appointed by the European Council. After consultations with the European Parliament and ECB Governing Council, the European Council will appoint the President of the ECB. The European Parliament will also vote on its President today. Mr. Speaker, subject to the approval of the European Parliament, this will be the first time that a woman will be made President of the European Commission. And I would like to congratulate Ursula von der Leyen on her nomination. This was a package supported by the UK, and it is in our national interest to have constructive relationships with those who are appointed. Once we leave the European Union, we will need to agree the details of our future relationship. We will continue to share many of the same challenges as our closest neighbours, and we will need to work with them on a variety of issues that are in our joint interests. But that will now be a matter for my successor to take forward, and I commend this statement to the House.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to say thank you to my friend, the member for Swansea East, for the fantastic campaign she's mounted and the comfort that she's brought to those that have been through the unimaginable strain of losing a child. And sadly, those that will lose a child in the future will at least know that because of her work, one part of the commemoration of that child's life will be made a little bit easier. On behalf of so many families, can we just say thank you very much for everything you've done? Mr. Speaker, I thank the Prime Minister for an advance copy of her statement. And while this year marks the 20th anniversary of the G20, there is little progress to commemorate in tackling the urgent challenges that we face. Where the leaders of the world's most powerful countries fail, instead we look to civil society, trade unions and community groups and an inspirational generation of young people for the transformative change that is required. This summit's communiqué did not make the necessary commitments on climate change. Does the Prime Minister agree that President Trump's failure to accept the reality of man-made climate change, his refusal to back the Paris Accords and his attempts to water down the communiqué's commitments are a threat to the security of us all over this planet? Is the Prime Minister concerned that he could soon be joined by one of her possible successors, who has described global warming as primitive fear without foundation? It is the responsibility of the G20 to lead efforts to combat climate change, as the Prime Minister herself acknowledged. These nations account for 4/5 of global greenhouse gas emissions. As I confirmed last week, we back the UK's bid to host COP26 next year. In 2017, the government agreed to making finance flows consistent with a pathway towards low greenhouse gas emissions in developing countries. So, can the Prime Minister explain why 97% of the UK's export finance support for energy in developing countries goes to fossil fuels and less than 1% for renewable energy? The government's pledge to cut carbon emissions by 2050 is an empty one. They have no serious plan to invest and continue to dismantle our renewable energy sector while supporting fracking. The Prime Minister says the international community must stand against Iran's destabilising activity in the region. Mr. Speaker, the Iran nuclear deal agreement was a multilateral agreement signed up to by President Obama and a number of other governments, but reneged on by President Obama's successor. Beyond just saying we need to protect the deal, what action has the Prime Minister taken to ensure this deal survives? What conversation did the Prime Minister have with President Trump on this issue? And isn't it about time that her government stood up to our supposed ally, Saudi Arabia? The Prime Minister says she met with Crown Prince bin Salman, but gives no details. So can I ask her, did she raise the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi? Did she raise the killing of thousands of Yemenis? Did she pledge to stop arms sales to Saudi Arabia? And did she raise with him their financing and arming of Libyan warlord Khalifa Haftar, who is fighting the UN-recognised government of Libya, and who, just last night, has been held responsible for an airstrike on a migrant centre in Tripoli that killed 40 people and injured dozens more? The Prime Minister rightly points to the need to protect people from terrorist propaganda. So, before she leaves office, will she finally release in full the report she suppressed into the Saudi government's funding of extremist groups? The Prime Minister talks of confronting countries that interfere in the democracy of other nations, including Russia. I remind her that it was this side of the House that delivered the amendments to the Sanctions and Money Laundering Bill, which introduced the Magnitsky powers. And the truth is, Mr. Speaker, the party opposite has questions to answer about the almost £1 million worth of donations from wealthy Russians to their party under her watch. So, if we stand up to corruption, condemn human rights abusing regimes, then politicians should not be trading cash for access. The Prime Minister mentioned the worrying outbreak of Ebola in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Could she outline what assistance DFID is providing to that terrible situation? I welcome the government's £1.4 billion for the Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB and malaria. However, the main conclusion of the G20 is that the world deserves better leadership for the urgent challenges facing humanity. Mr. Speaker, on to the EU Summit in Brussels, where it has taken the leaders 3 days to come up with a decision on who should take the EU's top jobs. But a three-day summit pales into insignificance to the 3 years of failure this government has inflicted on us all over Brexit. I would like to congratulate those who have been appointed or nominated to new roles within the European Union, especially Joseph Borrell as High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security. Mr. Speaker, for as long as we remain in the EU, we should seek reform. That includes increasing our efforts to tackle tax evasion and tax avoidance, stepping up our cooperation over the climate emergency that faces us all over this continent and this planet, and challenging migration policies that have left thousands to drown in the Mediterranean, while sometimes subcontracting migration policies to Libyan militias. Mr. Speaker, can the Prime Minister explain her decision for the Conservative Party to join a political group which includes far-right Islamophobic parties such as Vox of Spain? They claim Muslims will impose Sharia law on Spain, turn cathedrals into mosques and force all women to cover up. They're a party that campaigned to repeal gender violence laws and threatened to shut down feminist organisations. Does the Prime Minister understand the worry this will cause many people in this country who will be rightly asking why her party has aligned themselves with this far-right organisation, whose policies are built on division, discrimination and hate? Finally, Mr. Speaker, does the Prime Minister agree that whoever succeeds her should have the courage to go back to the people with their preferred Brexit option and end the uncertainty and get Brexit resolved?
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The right honourable gentleman raised a number of issues. They're moving between them, with sometimes no apparent link between the issues that he was talking about. I'll try to address the issues that he raised. On climate change, I've already expressed my disappointment that the United States has pulled out of the Paris Agreement. I have said, and I've repeated to the United States at the G20, to President Trump, that I hope that the United States will come back into the Paris Agreement in due course. I'm pleased that the other 19 members of the G20 held fast to the irreversibility of that Paris Agreement and to the commitments that we had previously made. And as I said earlier in answers in Prime Minister's questions, we're showing the lead on this. I'm encouraging others to follow, and others are showing their willingness to do so. He asked about the issue of climate change in relation to our international development money. I'm pleased to say that we've committed to provide at least $5.8 billion of international climate finance between 2016 and 2020. We're leading. This isn't just a question of people's energy mix, it's actually about climate resilience as well, and we're leading on that for the UN Climate Action Summit in September of this year. We've already helped 47 million people cope with the effects of climate change, supported 17 million people accessing clean energy, and reduced or avoided 10.4 million tonnes of CO2. So we are actually putting our words into action. He asked about my meeting with Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. I did indeed raise the killing of Jamal Khashoggi. I was very clear that we expected a transparent and open judicial process, and that we expect those who were responsible to be brought to account. I also raised the issue of Yemen and the importance of a political solution in Yemen, the fact that we are supporting Martin Griffiths, the UN Special Envoy's work on that, and that we want to ensure that all parties are committed to coming around the table and finding a political solution to Yemen in the future. He raised the issue of Ebola and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. I had a meeting with the Director General of the WHO at the G20 Summit, at which we discussed this. I also discussed it with the Secretary General of the United Nations. This is a serious humanitarian challenge. The security situation in eastern DRC makes the dealing with this outbreak more difficult. It makes it more difficult in terms of how one's operating through government and through other organisations. The United Nations and WHO are committed to working through community groups on the ground. He asked about our response. We're the second largest bilateral bilateral donor to the response in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and the largest to preparedness efforts in neighbouring countries. So we've been working not only where there has been an outbreak in DRC, but also to ensure that neighbouring countries can respond effectively. And I'm pleased to say that when there was a small number of cases in Uganda, Uganda responded extremely well, very professionally, and we have not seen further cases in Uganda. He mentioned the issue of Russia. I have to say, I thought it was a bit rich, the sort of comments that the Right Honourable Gentleman brought about Russia, when who was it, after the nerve agent attack on our streets in Salisbury, who believed the Russian government rather than our own intelligence agencies? It was the Right Honourable Gentleman. So I'll take no lessons from him on our relationships with Russia. He talked about the EU Council. I was sorry, I don't think I heard him welcome the gender balance that there was in the appointments of the top jobs there. I think it is important that we see the first woman nominated to be President of the European Commission and a woman nominated for the role at the European Central Bank. And he talked about the issue around Brexit. Of course, it was always going to take 2 years to negotiate. That's the time that is set out in the treaty under the Article 50 process. We brought the proposals to this House. The Right Honourable Gentleman rejected those proposals. The Right Honourable Gentleman has not brought forward proposals that can calm a majority of this. The Shadow Foreign Secretary, I think, says he has. Well, he brought... Oh, the House? Yeah, I had noticed that the House had not supported the plans that I brought forward, but it is, once again, it's a bit of a nerve from a party that consistently says it wants to leave with a deal, that it consistently voted against leaving with a deal. And he talks about going back to the people on Brexit. He talks about the sort of delay and what has happened in relation to Brexit and uncertainty. Can I just say to the Right Honourable Gentleman, we have been waiting for weeks now for the Labour Party's policy on Brexit. We keep being told the shadow cabinet are taking a decision about a second referendum. And week after week after week, we still wait to hear. And little wonder that the Shadow Home Secretary says that she's beginning to worry about Labour's Brexit policy.
Sir William